Okay, so have you ever wondered why genuine wisdom is such a rare and elusive thing in this world? Well, in this video, I'd like to explore that question, especially with respect to what I call the dimensionality of life as we know it. But before going into all of that, I should probably give a little credit where credit is due. And so I'd like to thank a local colleague of mine named Rick Chambers for encouraging me to make this video. So, little tip of the invisible chapeau to you, Rick Chambers. Anyhow, as I was saying in my last video, it seems to me that a fairly large fraction of our lives plays out across a two-dimensional space that's defined, naturally enough, by two axes. One of those axes runs between productivity and consumption, and the other between entertainment and boredom. In other words, a lot of our lives has to do with moving between being a producer who's working a job and being a consumer who's spending money. And at the same time, a lot of it has to do with trying to feel like we're entertained and happy rather than bored and unhappy. So basically, a pretty large fraction of our lives is about moving within the four quadrants of that two-dimensional space, oscillating between production and consumption on one hand, and between entertainment and boredom on the other. And for those of us who are thoroughly inured to it, living in that kind of flattened out world probably doesn't seem too bad. As long as we can make it through the work week, pay our bills, and binge watch a show or two on Netflix, well, life seems pretty good. As the old song from the 1980s puts it, everybody's working for the weekend, which is probably emblematic of that kind of modus vivendi. But for some of us, things don't really work that way, mostly because it seems really obvious that there's also a depth dimension to our lives, and probably higher order dimensions too. And the most important thing is to experience the greater depth of life as often and as powerfully as we can. But what does that depth dimension look like? Well, consider our spiritual or religious experiences. Those incredible moments when we feel the breath of divinity moving through us. When we feel like we're one with the cosmos, or maybe with all of life, or maybe we're in communion with God, when everything suddenly becomes radiant and poetic and sacred, including even our own souls. For some of us, those are the kinds of experiences that really matter, and that make sense of having to wade through all of life's daily flotsam and jetsam. And for those of us who cherish them, those experiences can even serve as the stars by which we navigate the storm-tossed seas of this world, and can imbue our lives with meaning, coherence, direction, and power. However, just as the mathematical z-axis contains two regions extending into infinite space, so too does the depth axis of life. And so, in addition to the spiritual side of life's depth, I'd say that the second region has to do with what the humanistic psychologist Abraham Maslow calls self-actualization. Basically, self-actualization involves recognizing and then living out our deepest possibilities in life. And ultimately, moving towards something like a powerful destiny, as opposed to just drifting through life more or less mechanically and listlessly. Of course, self-actualization can take different forms for different people. After all, what is a powerful destiny for one person can easily turn out to be a fruitless waste of time for another. But for all of us, self-actualization means awakening to a kind of power hidden within the deepest recesses of our being. It means learning to be true to ourselves, not only true to what we are, but true to what we can be in this life. True to the strange and singular nexus of possibility that would constitute our first and best destiny. So on one side of the z-axis, I'd place spiritual and religious experience. And on the other side, I'd place self-actualization and authenticity. However, I'd also say that in the culture of the United States, which is where I live, experiences in those areas seem relatively rare, especially in comparison to how much time we spend dwelling within the two-dimensional space defined by production and consumption on one hand, and by entertainment and boredom on the other. But at this point, the obvious question is probably, okay, but why does all of that matter? What is its relevance to our lives, both individually and collectively? Well, the first answer would be that seeing things in terms of dimensionality starts to make sense of a lot of the vexing problems plaguing our world these days, despite all of our best efforts to solve them. For instance, it seems fairly obvious that we're continuing to have problems relating well to each other, which would include large-scale phenomena like war, genocide, and generalized oppression, as well as smaller-scale things like the bitterness and factionalism that runs through a lot of public discourse these days, at least in the United States. However, I'd say that we also have problems relating well to ourselves, which would include our penchant for self-sabotage, self-harm, our struggles with addictions of various sorts, as well as our chronic reluctance to assume direct personal responsibility for the quality of our lives. And finally, I'd say that we're having problems relating to our world more generally, which would include our ongoing degradation and destruction of the natural environment, as well as the fact that we've wired the entire planet for instantaneous nuclear obliteration, either one of which could end up annihilating the biological basis for human existence. Oopsie. And it seems to me that all three of those very broad classes of problems share an important characteristic, which is that they're all rooted in our lack of wisdom. Basically, in the fact that while the human race has managed to acquire a fair amount of knowledge about the world, and has created some amazing technological advances as a consequence, we still haven't developed the wisdom to live well with what we know, at least not yet. But the thing that makes wisdom difficult for us is that it's usually born in the depth dimension, the dimension that we usually neglect, in the realms of spirituality and self-actualization, rather than in the two-dimensional space of production, consumption, entertainment, and boredom. In other words, the reason why we keep suffering from the same time-worn ailments year after year is that we've been trying to use two-dimensional logic to solve our world's three-dimensional problems. And as long as we continue to do that, our world will never heal, at least not in any appreciable way. Sure, we might occasionally be able to alleviate some of the symptoms of our world's malaise, which definitely has value, but we'll always fall short of curing its fundamental sickness, which is to say, curing our own sickness. But at this point, maybe I should talk a little about why living in a two-dimensional world isn't particularly conducive to cultivating the three-dimensional wisdom we desperately need. After all, isn't it theoretically possible to glean wisdom from life's most insignificant details? To see the world in a grain of sand, like Blake once said, or to realize that everything holds the secret, as Abraham Heschel once proclaimed. And yes, I'd agree that it's very definitely possible. But in practical terms, that's a pretty tall order for most of us. Mostly because our everyday two-dimensional world has a way of constantly deflecting our attention elsewhere, toward buying a shiny new cell phone, for instance, or maybe toward ogling the Kardashians as they take endless selfies of their own asses, or maybe toward ogling the Kardashians' asses on our shiny new cell phones. After all, what are our advanced technologies for, if not that? In essence, the problem with a two-dimensional world is that it operates mostly according to the logic of seduction and addiction rather than wisdom. Not only addiction in its most literal and physical sense, which is troublesome enough, but more importantly, addiction to figurative intoxicants like distraction, entertainment, and the never-ending enticements of commodity culture. And most of all, addiction to our own overweening self-importance, which, as I like to say, pretty much makes crystal meth look like chamomile tea. But what really makes all of that important is the fact that moving from a paradigm of seduction and addiction to one of actual wisdom is actually humanity's primary evolutionary struggle at this point in history, part and parcel of the whole overarching question of where we are and where we're going, and why it's worth going there in the first place. And a big part of that evolutionary struggle has to do with recognizing that living in a two-dimensional world like ours isn't very commensurate with the actual depth of our souls, which is the locus of wisdom in the first place. In essence, we've created a world that doesn't fit us very well, at least not at the level of our innermost being. And sure, maybe we can grit our teeth and tolerate living an unwise, soulless life for a while. And we might even be able to eke out an entire lifetime that way. But that doesn't necessarily mean that our existence is being consummated at any point. And maybe it's just me, but I suspect that that's what we human beings really want. To consummate our time in this world. To bring our existence to its fullest and most sublime point. Preferably more often rather than less often. In other words, beneath the seething maelstrom of all of our more superficial and transient desires, I suspect that there's an abiding kind of hunger. A kind of secret ravenousness to experience the real depth of life, to feel its miraculous charm passing through us, just like our breath, to feel it as something palpable and intimate and undeniably real. But if all of that's true, then the obvious question is probably, okay, but what's standing in our way? Why is it that most of us don't experience that sort of thing a lot more often? So at this point, let's take a look at what I see as 4 significant obstacles to experiencing the greater depth of life and developing a little wisdom along the way, and hence furthering humanity's evolutionary process. The first of those would have to do with the historical inertia of our prevailing cultural practices, especially here in the West. Basically, we continue to tolerate a two-dimensional world, partly because most of us don't expect anything better. In essence, we're used to setting our sights way too low, mostly because, because that's what we've been taught, and that's what everyone else is doing too. And it's been that way for as long as anyone can remember. And so anything that deviates from that historically ingrained pattern, anything that seems truly resonant and deep and wise, naturally feels weird, foreign, and maybe even a little scary. And so it's easy to react negatively to it. An example. Let's see if we can think of an example. Has it ever struck you as odd how historical personages who seem to be bearers of life's greater wisdom often end up being killed off by the people around them, and fairly frequently while they're still young? Not all of those people, to be sure, but a lot more than chance alone would permit. For instance, consider the cases of Socrates, Jesus, Abraham Lincoln, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., etc. Do you suppose that that's just some sort of weird coincidence? Because personally, I'd say probably not. And so the first obstacle would have to do with our habitual cultural practices, which often run counter to cultivating wisdom and experiencing the depth of life. But beyond that, it seems to me that institutionalized power also plays an important role. Basically, it's not in power's interest to let us perceive things too deeply or to become genuinely wise, because if we did, then we might also begin to perceive how silly and cloddish our world's power games really are. And that's the last thing that institutionalized power wants. It doesn't want us to become perceptive enough or smart enough or wise enough to start questioning it in any serious way, or to begin orienting ourselves toward things that lie beyond its purview, or, God forbid, to stop taking it seriously altogether. An example. Power ends up structuring the institution of education pretty much along those lines, in a way where wisdom almost never appears among its primary goals. mostly because it seems irrelevant to the more immediate task of producing competent workers who can fuel the engine of production and consumption. To paraphrase the great comedian George Carlin, what power wants is obedient workers. People who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept it. And because institutionalized power tends to structure our values and our consciousness that way, I'd say that anyone who's willing to seek out the real depth of life, anyone who's willing to consummate his or her existence for any amount of time, is already in a state of rebellion, already militating against the status quo. And if all of that is starting to sound a little like your own life, well then I'd say that you're already an agent of the infinite, whether you realize it or not. And if it doesn't sound much like your life, well, you might start to wonder about how you really want to spend your time in this world. Remember that you are unique in the universe. There's only one of you, and there will never, ever be another. And your time in this land is actually very fleeting, all things considered. So, would you rather spend it constantly whirring like a well-oiled gear within the world's machinery? Or is your deeper desire to feel like an ecstatically free agent of the infinite? And okay, I realize that it's a very personal question that undoubtedly has a very personal answer. But I'd also say that it's not a bad question, especially in a time and place like this. Anyhow, I'd say that a third and even bigger obstacle to developing wisdom has to do with a kind of paradox woven into its nature, and it goes like this. It would take wisdom to recognize that what we're lacking is wisdom. Similarly, it would take some sense of life's depth to recognize that we're living in a two-dimensional space in the first place. And because of those sorts of paradoxes, it's very easy for us just to keep grinding along in our mostly two-dimensional world and to continue bemoaning its perennial deficiencies when they appear on the nightly news. And finally, I'd say that a fourth impediment would have to do with an addiction that I mentioned earlier. Namely, our addiction to our own self-importance. After all, that's what keeps the human race stuck on the uppermost part of the Dunning-Kruger curve, thoroughly convinced that we know what we're doing, when in reality, we're many, many miles away from it. And from that lofty perch, it seems like we've already arrived, like we're already wise enough, already living deeply enough, and like there's no real reason to question or improve ourselves. But as so often happens with the Dunning-Kruger effect, all of that turns out to be a complete illusion. And at that point, the healthiest thing for us would be to experience a catastrophic moment of disillusionment. A moment that would doubtlessly feel like a disaster, but that would actually herald a new and much wiser relation to life. Basically, a moment when humility can start to eclipse our habitual self-importance. A moment when we can let go of a lot of our excess egoistic baggage and start to be a little bit more realistic about how small we really are in comparison to the incomprehensible vastness that surrounds us. But of course, that too is fraught with a degree of paradox, especially since we're not usually humble enough to recognize that we're not humble enough. So those are what I see as 4 important obstacles to developing wisdom and learning to live more along life's depth dimension. The first would be our habitual cultural practices. The second would be the effects of institutionalized power. The third would be wisdom's paradoxical nature. And the fourth would be our addiction to our own self-importance. Of course, that's hardly a comprehensive list, but it should at least provide a few inroads into understanding some of the problems we're facing as we attempt to negotiate the evolutionary passage from addiction to wisdom. So, at this point, since we're on the edge of talking about possible prescriptive suggestions, let's just dive into that. First, in addition to cultivating humility as a corrective to our runaway self-importance, which would be prescriptive suggestion number 1, I'd like to suggest developing 2 more interrelated capacities: self-awareness and courage. Let's look at self-awareness first, which I'd say is itself prone to a measure of paradox, especially since it would take self-awareness to recognize that we need to develop self-awareness. But, excuse me, despite that, I'd say that it's definitely worthwhile to find a way of actively practicing and cultivating it, perhaps out of sheer curiosity, if nothing else. And as I like to say so often in these videos, for me personally, meditation has proven to be a wonderful way of doing that. But if meditation isn't your cup of tea, well, there are certainly other ways. Creative experience, prayer and religious devotion, physical activity, who knows how many there are. But the important thing is to find at least one way of practicing self-awareness, not only for our own personal benefit, but for the rest of humanity too, and perhaps even for the universe as a whole. Because at the end of the day, perhaps the universe is trying to become conscious of itself through us. That we are the universe becoming conscious of itself. However, it's also important to recognize that developing self-awareness isn't necessarily an easy thing. In fact, it's usually just the opposite. The reason is that we pretty much all engage in self-deception in various ways and to varying degrees. We're pretty much all great actors, great pretenders, and great liars too. Most of all to ourselves. And the very first lie we usually tell ourselves is, I'm not lying to myself. And while that may sound harsh, in reality, there's no reason to feel ashamed of it or morally indignant about it. It's really nothing more than life. Life wending its tricky, circuitous way through us. But at the same time, that's also why cultivating self-awareness takes a fair amount of courage. Because, as Nietzsche once famously observed, even the most courageous among us only rarely has enough courage to face what he really knows. That's from Twilight of the Idols, by the way. In other words, being honest with ourselves requires courage because it means dropping our usual egoistic investments in self-importance and stepping beyond our comfort zones and safe spaces. It requires becoming dangerous to ourselves and courting catastrophe as if it were one of life's great passions. Basically, it means adopting a fundamentally adventurous posture toward life, where any moment might bring us into the howling gale of sudden transformation. Because very few things in this world are as dangerous or as adventurous as honesty and learning to call things by their proper names. And while that may seem like a daunting task, as Confucius once noted, it's also the beginning of all wisdom. So I guess that those would be my 3 prescriptive suggestions for developing more wisdom and learning to live more in life's depth dimension. First, cultivating humility as a corrective to our self-importance. Second, developing self-awareness. And finally, developing enough courage to see the process through. But beyond all of that, maybe it would help to bring wisdom and the depth of life into the ambit of our prevailing linguistic practices. To start talking about them, at least now and then, as if they're things that actually matter. Perhaps even more than the Kardashians' asses. That sounds crazy. I know, right? And actually, full disclosure, that's part of why I'm making this video, to take at least one small step in that direction. Anyhow, thanks as always for taking the time to listen. I appreciate your attention and I appreciate your presence in this world. I guess at this point, I'd also like to take a few seconds to apologize for not posting any videos for what? Almost a year, I think. The truth is that I've been through some pretty difficult times lately, which have included accompanying my mother through the process of dying last December. And I'm still carrying a pretty heavy emotional weight from all of that. So I appreciate your patience through those long months. So thank you all for all of that. And of course, as always, take care of your soul.